So here you've got two, I just want to outline the two alliances because the colors aren't quite as clear. You have Russia, France, and Great Britain in the Triple Entente, and Germany, Austria, and Italy in the Triple Alliance. Wasn't inevitable, of course, that the powers would line up this way. And even this system did not play out in exactly the way one expected. As I mentioned, these systems managed to weather a number of storms, which sometimes drove partners closer to each other for fear of isolation. But what the alliance system did do was to perpetrate sort of an important idea that war was inevitable, that it was coming. And that's a dangerous idea. The belief that something is inevitable can cause people to expect certain things. If you think about the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, perhaps you'll notice something about these two camps. Each one included a partner whose internal situation was particularly precarious or particularly unstable. In the case of the Triple Alliance, it was Austria-Hungary. It had internal divisions, sub-conflicts among different national groups, particularly in its newly acquired territories of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And the Germans allowed their more reckless partner to take the initiative. This is also true of the Triple Entente. Russia was unstable itself, and Britain and France sort of allowed Russia to push forward the Triple Entente's foreign policy. The Russians, of course, had lost the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War. They had experienced a revolution in 1905. So there was a lot of internal division within the country. In other words, the loosest cannons among the partners ended up playing the most significant role in the build-up to World War I. So the alliance is an important factor in sort of escalating what began as a local conflict in Bosnia into a European conflict. But how do you explain World War? For that, we're going to factor in imperialism, which I'll get to. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about personalities. Because in World War I, individuals played a considerable role in exacerbating the conflict. In the early 20th century, diplomacy was sort of a so-called gentleman's game. Most diplomats were members of the officer corps, and they came from aristocratic families. Many were titled. So if you can imagine it, it's a world where honor and family heritage played an important role. And this took precedence over ideas, over accountability, and over sort of a sense of duty to populations. The chief of staff of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was one Konrad von Hötzenberg, who by 1906 was actually quite elderly. He was from a noble family. And in 1914, he was one of the biggest proponents for war after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife. He wanted to teach Serbia a lesson about protecting the image of and the interests of the Habsburgs. But for von Hötzenberg, it was also about his own personal pride. His diary actually makes clear that he fell in love with a married woman, a much younger married woman, and that he wanted to prove how much power he had and prove his virility and his usefulness. And war, he believed, was a way to do this. This potentially has a lot to do with foreign policy, because it's not a democratic system where one can be called to task. So his personal motivations blended with the interests of the state as he perceived them. In terms of the other countries, European royal families, of course, were related to one another. These spoke common language, generally French. They corresponded. They even vacationed together. Bless you. And sought marriage sort of within the same circles. George V of England, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Nicholas II of Russia were actually all cousins. They were the grandchildren of Queen Victoria. And I don't have pictures of all of them, unfortunately, but they all looked alike, funnily enough. You might think that this would make relations easier, but it could actually make things more humiliating. You know, of course, that Wilhelm II was sort of smarting under British naval superiority. He wanted Germany's so-called place in the sun. We also know that Nicholas II of Russia experienced a series of humiliating defeats, and that he had to give up some of his power to the Duma in 1905. So, in an era where politics were personal, slights could be taken personally, and it could be to the detriment of nations. Personal rivalries made some of these key people act out more recklessly, perhaps, than they otherwise would have. It's probably a general rule among people that someone who's humiliated tends to act badly. Let's turn to the actual outbreak of war. If you think back to June 1914, we think of it as a chain of events. This chain of events is always harnessed to the question, who is responsible? And this question took on a particularly important moral value after the war, given the amount of destruction and carnage and suffering that the war caused. We need to pull these events apart, and you see that the question of who is responsible isn't as easy as that. In 1908, this is not a great map, unfortunately, but in 1908, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire annexed, where are they? Bosnia, Herzegovina, which was actually went against the Berlin Congress of 1878, which stipulated that Austria-Hungary could occupy the two provinces, but they were still to be a part of the Ottoman Empire. And the population in these provinces, or in these territories, was mixed, but it did include many ethnic Serbs. Other foreign powers, of course, were interested in this region. Serbia was furious that the territories where many Serbs lived would be incorporated into Habsburg Empire. It actually mobilized its army. It was backed by Russia, but it didn't lead to war because the Hungarian leaders in Austria-Hungary didn't want to fight. Franz Ferdinand himself was opposed to war, and it helped to defuse the crisis. Actually, Russia at the time wasn't prepared to fight, they just weren't ready. And it didn't have France support. France wasn't willing to go to war over the Balkans, where it didn't have any interests. So Serbia backed down, Russians backed down, and Austria-Hungary continued on with its annexation of Bosnia. In June 1914, Franz Ferdinand was traveling. Best picture I can find of him. So here's Bosnia. He was traveling in Sarajevo with his wife, and he was coming to review the troops. And he was doing this to assert Austrian-Hungarian dominance over the region. The imperial presence in these territories was new, and it had been contested. So he sort of wanted to solidify their power. Of course, as I said, he was assassinated by Bosnian Serbs, and with some backing from Serbia. And it was called the shot that rang round the world. But it wasn't as simple as it seemed. The Black Hand was the Bosnian Serb organization that assassinated Franz Ferdinand during his motorcade on its way to the hospital to visit wounded soldiers. The Black Hand had about 2,500 members, and its goal was sort of pan-Serbianism, and its motto was union or death. So I just want to read you a couple of its articles and its purposes. Said this organization prefers terrorist action to intellectual propaganda, and for this reason it must remain absolutely secret. It will organize revolutionary activity in all territories inhabited by Serbs, but it will maintain amicable relations with states and peoples who support the Serbian element. Now, the assassination actually was not well planned at all or well executed. It didn't go smoothly, so it almost took place by accident or in spite of itself. There were 7 conspirators, and they were all placed along Franz Ferdinand's route with the idea or the hope that one of them would get a clear shot at Franz Ferdinand and his wife. And one did. One of the conspirators actually threw a bomb, but Franz Ferdinand and his wife were not injured, and the conspirator was apprehended. The entourage stopped, and they debated about what to do. Franz Ferdinand decided it was his duty to continue on to the hospital, so that's what they did. And here again, it's this sort of element of chance or coincidence, because along the way, they sort of ended up entering a very, very narrow street, and they had to stop, and they had to turn around. So as they're turning around, by chance, the very last conspirator, Gavrilo Princip, happened to be standing on this particular corner. He was able to get a clear shot. He shot Franz Ferdinand in the abdomen, in the neck, and Sophie in the abdomen. And actually, nobody knew what had happened. The military governor of the province was traveling with them and didn't realize what had happened until blood came out of Franz Ferdinand's mouth. When he asked him, this is a bit strange, but when he asked him if he was okay, Franz Ferdinand's response was, "Es ist nichts," which means in German, "it's nothing." However, they proceeded on to the hospital, and he died shortly afterward. But the assassination itself didn't launch the war. It wasn't all that shocking. And hostilities, as I mentioned at the beginning, began a month later. In any case, Franz Ferdinand wasn't very popular politically or personally. Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, was actually critical of Franz Ferdinand. He didn't have a good relationship with him. He resented the fact that he felt that Franz Ferdinand had married, so I guess beneath his status. So after the assassination, there was the usual period of public mourning, but that was about it. There wasn't really a great sadness. Here things get a little bit complicated, but it was a notion among many in the Austrian-Hungarian leadership that this event could actually provide an opportunity to teach a lesson to Bosnian Serbs that they were now a part of the empire, and they needed to stop plotting. It was also an opportunity to teach Serbia itself to stop interfering in the affairs of the empire. So in other words, Austrian officials wanted to use this assassination as a pretext to crush Serbia and crush pan-Serbianism. But this isn't an automatic move from the assassination to war. It was calculated. It was an opportunity. But Austria was reluctant to go to war without without cover, so they asked Germany, "Will you back us?" Of course, we know that Germany issued the famous blank check. And basically, the blank check was that German officials, with the permission of the Kaiser, pledged that they would back Austria-Hungary in whatever measures they took. Germany was quite reckless because it feared isolation. And again, this is one of the key weaknesses of the alliance system. It puts power in the hands of the most reckless members. Meanwhile, Russian diplomats were observing the situation, and they knew that a crisis was building. They suspected that Austria-Hungary would retaliate against Serbia, and they approached their alliance partners to ask if they would back them if Russia intervened. France said, "Yeah, go ahead, we'll back you." So France didn't hold Russia back either. The Austrians drew up an ultimatum for Serbia with a very, very short turnaround time, 48 hours. They demanded that the Serbs conduct a full investigation of the assassination, that the perpetrators be punished, that Serbia cease backing anti-Habsburg activity, and that Habsburg officials be allowed to enter Serbia to help with the investigation and to look at its records. Now, Serbia actually accepted all stipulations except allowing officials to access its records, because that was a breach of national sovereignty. Austria, in response, declared war on July 28th and bombarded Belgrade. So war began. So the question of who is responsible depends on which war. The Black Hand fired the first shot. It was escalated to a regional conflict by Austria, with German permission, but it's still regional. It's the alliance system that escalates it to a European war. Russia didn't want to abandon Serbia, but as a big country, Russian mobilization is slow. The Russian Tsar decided to mobilize as sort of a warning to Austria-Hungary not to attack Serbia. Because it's such a large country, however, the Tsar's officers recommended full mobilization. So the Russians had full mobilization, and this move escalated it to a European war, because Germany then pushes it over the top. Viewing it as a direct threat, given their common border, Germany implemented the Schlieffen Plan. This is named after the former War Minister, Alfred von Schlieffen. And the Schlieffen Plan meant that Germany had to sort of precipitate or seize the moment, and that meant a preemptive attack. So Germany was supposed to have a lightning strike through Belgium to knock out France, and then would move east. On August 1st, 1914, in response to Russia's mobilization, Germany issued a declaration of war on Russia after the Russian government ignored its order to cancel mobilization. The German army demanded passage through neutral Belgium, which refused. So Germany invaded Belgium on August 2nd. On August 3rd, it declared war on France. And on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. This meant all of its colonies, dominions, and ensured that the European war then became a world war. So if you ask who caused the war, you have to ask yourself which war. There are different people responsible for different actions. David Lloyd George, after the war, said that we all stumbled in. But I'm hoping that what you gathered from this lecture today is that some people and some countries had more responsibility than others. Okay. So on Tuesday, we will talk about the Great War as Total War. Have a great weekend.